In today's clip, I want to talk about whether I'm sticking to the 4% rule in my personal post-fire life. Hey, XenPuck here. So constantly, because I'm on the FIRE Facebook group, I hear the question of whether the 4% rule still matters. And since I already made a clip specifically on whether I think the 4% rule is still relevant, this time I think I'll just concentrate on my personal experience, right? Based on actual evidence on what I actually spent last year for a household as a percentage of my net worth. Obviously, caveat right up front, right? 2020, that was last year, weird year. Due to the pandemic, there's less travel and less general entertainment spending. I'm not super concerned with that, like how that might skew the numbers, because while those categories were less, most of us were also super paranoid as heck right in the beginning of the pandemic with that whole bunkering mentality, right? And spent all sorts of apocalyptic, kind of like scenarios stocking up of materials and goods, right? And for things like travel, that's always dependent on market conditions anyway, right? So for people who are about to fire or did just achieve fire, as I always say, it's not like you suddenly ignore a terrible market drop and keep on traveling in the same exact manner in the years when the market's down anyway, right? Especially because I'm talking about people who are interested in fire. If you're interested in fire, that means you can plan ahead. If you can do that, do so to the extent you can retire early, these are the same people that definitely will be able to adapt along the way, right? So let's get into my actual spending versus what I thought I was going to spend, that sort of thing, right? Number one. So first of all, I gotta define what's really part of my yearly budget at this point, right? Well, a lot of it is recurring expenses. Some are easy to calculate. All this like streaming services, phones, healthcare, recurring utility bills, right? Then there's food. That's not actually quite recurring. I mean, it's recurring, but it's not the exact same every month, right? So, and there's also limited entertainment options that are still available during the pandemic years, such as like video games, right? And yet, there are still gifts and home improvements since we just bought a house last year and moved to a new state. So these are significant life changes, but I would call them, the peripherals of costs that are associated with these events. That's going to happen pretty much every year, right? In fact, we actually had two separate moving-related costs because both wifey and I moved from different states to the same place, so twice the cost there, right? Also included were tax payments because 2020 was literally my last year of filing taxes as a single person. Now, normally you'd think my tax burden would be lower, but it wasn't because I needed to make a massive purchase at the end of 2019 to prepare for newly married life in 2020, right? So surprisingly, despite not having a real job, my taxable income for the year prior that I paid in 2020 was still significant. I'd call it probably top 5% of the country still, even though without a job, right? And since all that income was not coming through an employer, that means that I had to physically go pay the government myself, right? There's no deductions being taken out or anything. So I think that ends basically what I count as regular expenses, right? Anyway, so when it all boils down, what percentage of my net worth did I actually spend, and what percentage, if any, did I continue to reinvest in the forms of, let's say, dividends? Let's say extra cash that I generated, right? The answer is 2% to spend and another around 1% that was reinvested, okay, out of the cash that I got. So you can think of it as, instead of following a 4% rule, essentially I followed a 3% withdrawal rule, and my expenses still ended up being so conservative that I got to reinvest a third of that 3% that I generated, right? Look, I want to make it clear that this 3%, living by this 3%, really 2% is what I spend on regular living, is by no means guarantees me a luxurious lifestyle, okay? I'd say basically it's solid middle class in terms of living arrangements. After all, we were in a pandemic most of last year, right? There's really not much of luxuries that we could even get, even if we were hell-bent on it, right? And yet, I think this is a great starting point, right? Because if I can live on 2% alone, which is half of the 4% rule that I still think is very relevant, see my other clip, somewhere in my hundreds of clips, well, more than 100 anyway. The other 2% at the end of the day can simply be thought of as a money fund when we need it, or simply be used for a longer term capital generation type of vehicle, which is always personally my preference, right? Now, having told you that answer, I should note several asterisks with my number, with my essentially 2% spending, actual 2% spending out of my net worth, right? What doesn't it include? Well, it doesn't include the following, because these are, to me, like one-time costs that are unlikely to recur even, say, in a 5-year time frame on average. Number one, it was in 2020 when we moved, I did buy my wife's car out, okay? Because I promised her I'd buy out her lease, and due to where our new house is located that we both picked together, one car seems reasonable, more reasonable, in fact, than zero car, which would have been my personal preference, right? So this was essentially, I counted as a gift that I gave my wife, right? And the reason why I didn't count this is because I expect this type of purchase to last about a decade, actually. Especially considering how little stress we'd be putting on this car, especially when my wifey finally decides to retire, hopefully in the near future. And number two, this is quite major, housing improvements or housing renovations. Because we got a new house last year, well, it's not new, it's an old house, but it's new to us, right? Wifey wants to do lots of things with it, so we definitely started pouring quite a bit into the house in 2020. We'll continue to do so in 2021, possibly next year to make it our kind of dream home, right? Again, I'm fine with this because, you know, how often do you have to fix up a house? Not that often, right? Even though I personally have multiple properties, it's like you buy a house, you fix it up, and then you don't really touch it for, again, probably a decade at the very least, right? And especially I'm fine with pouring money into this house because the local market that we're in it is exploding so amazingly that despite sinking significant resources into this house, the increase in value since the past about year and a quarter is already pacing the increase in the resources, even when I count the additional resources that I'm pouring into the renovation, right? And that's before our renovations are even done, right? Can you imagine that? Because once the renovations are done, the house value will go up even more, to be honest, right? Now, to be clear, I'm also personally much more relaxed about, you know, these larger, significant one-time costs, such as, you know, a relatively new car and massive home renovation projects, because my wife is still working, okay? Now, this part I can only attribute to luck, right? I could carry all these costs alone, you know, and more or less that's what I've been doing, at least last year, right? But because I'm so lucky, got a life partner who's not only not a burden, but actually really are able to help out. These are the kinds of things that I could have never planned for, right? But sure am glad that I have, right? So think about that. Anyway, as I mentioned in some other clip of mine, last year alone, my net worth went up by more than 10%. And here I am basically saying I just only spent 2% on regular expenses, right? Sure, there are home renovations and a practically new car purchase, but I also get married. And those expenses can't compare to my awesome wife pay from last year, okay? So our overall household net worth increased at an even faster rate, right? It's been more than 2 years since my early retirement. This is exactly why I would never even consider going back to a regular job with the layers of bureaucracy and bosses ever again. Why would I? Money does help make money, and I'm a glorious example of achievable levels of that, okay? I add that last bit of, you know, achievable level because, look, I'm not Johnny Depp, right? The dude's got like 50 houses around the world and is still facing bankruptcy despite being a super big star, right? I just have a handful of assets, all of which, you know, they're in various categories, but all of which are generating money for me, right? And I can't empathize enough. Well, I can easily sustain a regular Joe lifestyle, right? Maybe with a little bit of flair here and there, and I'm totally fine with that, right? To me, flashy displays of money are for the uneducated and uncultured of the world, right? They are the lowest of plebs who want to look rich but aren't, right? Learn about fire and get to choose your own life again, and I'm sure you'd start to agree with me more and more. Because when you think about it, there's no purchase as valuable or as expensive that you can make than buying back your own time. Okay? Anyway, comment, like, and subscribe and all that jazz. Cheers. See you guys next time.